Welcome back, everyone, to another enlightening episode of the All Me podcast. And we're back today with Ashley Anderson, who is a registered pharmacist and is going to share with us her passion for sports pharmacy. And Ashley, you and I were connected by Ryan Murphy, who is the executive director for the Partnership for Clean Competition. And we interviewed him in a podcast just a few episodes back. Ashley is the founder of the International Sports Pharmacists Network, which is an organization that helps promote integrity among sports pharmacists involved in sport. And she's a leader in her field, and we're super lucky to have you today. So, Ashley, thank you again for taking time out of your schedule, and welcome to the All Me podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I know this is going to be an interesting topic because when Ryan and I first, got connected, and I guess you had reached out and we were talking about education programs and this and that, I was like, this is a fascinating conversation. I was like, please, I hope she'll let us interview her for the podcast because I think the listeners will really like this. And I think it's probably best. Let's just get started. What led you to become a sports pharmacist, and what made you passionate about this whole field?
Yeah, sure. So originally, when I was in pharmacy school, I was really interested in pharmacognosy, which is the study of herbal medicines and how herbs work in the body. And when I got to school, I discovered that kind of was being phased out of what pharmacists do. And so, I continued to kind of follow that path, and it led me into dietary supplements and really exploring those and understanding those really in depth and the lack of regulation on the market. And then at the time, just shortly out of school, I was living in Colorado Springs, and just because of the proximity to the Olympic Training Center and all the athletes that are there, I just happened to have several friends who were either training at the Olympic Training Center or were recreational athletes, because it's so common to just be outdoorsy and, be involved in sports here. And so I was answering questions for my friends who knew I was a pharmacist, and they knew I had this experience in herbal medicine. And, that kind of opened up my eyes to understanding that athletes are a unique patient population, basically, which is something we're not taught in pharmacy school. So, the things that I love about pharmacy are really the chemistry and understanding how things work in the body. And a part of knowing sports pharmacy is seeing that exercise and body composition can really change how a person's body responds to medications, different than we might see in somebody who has underlying, chronic conditions of some sort. So athletes are considered a unique patient population, and that's what kind of makes sports pharmacy a little bit different than regular pharmacy.
Okay, yeah, because I remember when we were first talking, I got to thinking, okay, I wonder if there's like a sports pharmacist at my local Walgreens where I get my prescription filled. So, as you know, I was made of questions. Felt like I was just berating you with them because I was so interested. But it really does make sense. But one of the things in your career that we talked about that I kind of want to discuss is the work that you did with the United States Anti-Doping Agency. In fact, we just did a podcast with Dr. Matthew Fedoruk on Trenbolone that's coming out very soon. And I wanted to kind of know what was your role with them and what got you interested in that world of anti-doping?
Yeah. So again, it was kind of just being in the right place at the right time. Because I was living in Colorado Springs and USADA is based in Colorado Springs. I happened to be in a business class with somebody who worked at USADA, and as soon as I learned that, I was like, oh my gosh, athletes and drugs, this is an area of interest to me. You must have tons of pharmacists that work for you. And she was like, no, actually, we only have one. And, it was, that was relatively new. The USADA had only been around for a couple of years at that point. And they had basically absorbed the pharmacist who was doing the drug information line for athletes at the Olympic Training Center and taken him into the USADA program. And he was basically taking calls from athletes or whoever wanted to ask questions about medications. And I ended up meeting with him, and luckily he needed more help at that time. And so they hired me on initially to answer calls on the drug reference line. And, then I became more involved in the sports or the science team, the science department, which also did therapeutic use exemptions. And we recognized that there just weren't good resources for athletes in the way of drug information resources, especially when it came to the status in sport. And so I helped interpret the WADA prohibited list to put it into more meaningful terms as to what was, not okay for athletes to take based on what prescriptions we commonly see in the US market. And so originally I helped put together some athlete training resources. And then from there, we noticed obviously that there were a lot of common calls that were repeated on the drug reference line. So, we created some frequently asked questions that we posted up. And then I think it was around 2009, maybe, we began creating a searchable drug database that, we had used this
That's
drug
cool.
database for ourselves internally at USADA, just to look and see and kind of verify for ourselves and confirm, yeah, that one's okay and this one's not okay. And we ended up, making that into what Global DRO is today. So for the majority of the rest of my years at USADA, I was actually the ingredient manager for Global DRO.
That makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, especially when it comes to banned substances and what athletes are taking. I even go back to when I was a college athlete, and at that time we couldn't even take NyQuil, right? Because there was some banned substance in NyQuil. If you were taking NyQuil for the common cold and you were drug tested the next day, there was a good chance you could test positive. But as I'm thinking about this, especially, for our listeners too, it's like if you have a pharmacist on staff, somebody actually that deals with these drugs, went to school to learn with these drugs, how do they, what's actually in these drugs, what are the ingredients, and then you correlate that with the banned substance list, it makes you a lot more, I guess, a better tool for these athletes that, hey, I'm getting really good information here from somebody that actually studied this in school, and there's not a whole lot of guesswork. So I'm sure it saved them a lot of time as well, too.
Yeah. Yeah. For us, it's really easy to look at those lists and know what is a prescription and what is something that would be bought, as a legal drug or an illicit substance. And because those names obviously just pop out at us just because we're familiar with them. And, one other thing is that I'm sure you're aware that all those lists have this catch-all phrase at the end of similar biological effects or chemical structures. And when I was originally trying to pitch sports pharmacy services to some athletic departments, I would have the athletic directors or, other healthcare professionals on the team say, well, you'd have to be a chemist or a pharmacist in order to interpret that. And I was like, yeah,
That's what I am. Yeah.
my area. I love it. So, it's to a lot of people when they look at those lists, it is just a list of chemical names, but to us it's, there's medications on there. We know how to use them appropriately, and we know how to make the adjustments to either fit them into the exceptions that WADA has created or, meet the categories of what's required by NCAA or other sports. And then we know ones we have to avoid.
So if somebody like needs a particular drug,
Mhm.
okay, I mean, testosterone's a bad example. There are people that actually need it, but I know it's hard to get a TUE or therapeutic use exemption. So would you work directly with the athlete, I guess, and the athlete's doctor to determine, hey, maybe there's an alternative drug we can use here to make sure they don't test positive? I guess that would be question one. Or question two, as you're working with this athlete or their coach or whomever it might be, to make sure that, okay, if let's say they have to take this prescription drug, whatever it might be, and you probably have some good examples of that, they're likely going to test positive for this. So you would kind of, I guess, help
Yeah.
navigate through that. So, okay, hey, I know I'm going to test positive for this, but I already have this TUE in place. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah. So, the first thing is based on the athlete's level of competition, and whether or not they might be tested. That's one of the things that we consider kind of first in the background. But as a clinical pharmacist, really the first thing I'm looking at is what is the indication and what does that mean to this person in their sport? So, as you know, some sports require more endurance, some require more power and strength, so I'm first of all evaluating, is this the best medication selection for that individual for their sport? And pharmacists don't do diagnosing. We don't really do the workup for the athlete. And so a lot of times if a pharmacist is lucky enough to be involved in that decision-making process, then we help with the best selection of whatever, medication is being chosen for that therapy. But a lot of times pharmacists are on kind of the back end where we don't see the prescription until the discussion has already taken place with the prescriber. And then a lot of times in my career, I've tried to move to that pre-prescribing area so that I can work directly with the athlete as they're involved in the decision-making process for what the treatment's going to be, with the doctor involved. But on the back end, it's easier for the pharmacist to call the prescriber and say, hey, this doesn't work for this athlete in this situation because of these reasons. And so, as I was mentioning, the first thing that I consider is it appropriate for this indication for this individual, based on basically our sport. And then secondly, considering what is the status in sport, if it is something that's prohibited, is this really the drug of choice for that condition? And if not, what alternatives do we have that are not prohibited? And so the pharmacist can really help with that, even looking for drugs in a different class that are not prohibited, or what steps are needed to take to apply for a therapeutic use exemption. And a lot of that is about getting the best documentation in place, so that we can explain why this medication is the best choice for that individual, even though the medication is prohibited. And the WADA actually has really good guidance documents on, helping us walk through that. Like, did you consider these alternatives first? They're not prohibited, even if it's a non-drug option. So,
and I think, it's, again, you couldn't ask for somebody better, especially if you are a drug tested athlete that I don't want to test positive, and you have all the tools there in front of you to ask these questions. So what kind of keeps going through my mind, and I know the answer is pretty simple because we talked about it, and I'm sure as a listener, they're wondering, okay, so is my pharmacist that works at Walgreens or CVS, is he or she a sports pharmacist as well? Or really what makes the difference? Or is it, maybe just a pharmacist that works in sports? Can you kind of explain the difference?
Sure. So believe it or not, this is not part of the core pharmacy curriculum, which means we're not taught about this in school. So very few pharmacists are exposed to even anti-doping regulations. They might not be familiar with WADA code. They might not be familiar with the prohibited list. I've talked to many pharmacists who don't even recognize that or like DHEA is on the prohibited list, or that diuretics, which are, water pills, are on the prohibited list, same with stimulants. So it's not something that every pharmacist knows, but there are so many medications nowadays that a lot of times pharmacists are specializing in a certain treatment category. And so you will find pharmacists who have specialized in the treatment of athletes and know these kind of things much better. But right now, there's not a set standard for qualifications, but there are courses that athletes or pharmacists can take in order to become well trained in this topic. Some of it is self-learning, but it's not every pharmacist that would know this. And, as I mentioned before, the other thing is that I recognize athletes are a unique patient population, and a lot of pharmacists don't even consider, is this person an athlete or not? So that question might not even cross a typical pharmacist's mind, like in a retail setting, for instance. So it's kind of up to the athlete to say, hey, I'm an athlete, and I know I might have some additional restrictions, and can you help me with that? And then they can find the tools in order to look up the answer. And pharmacists are so particular when it comes to the details of medications. I think every pharmacist wants to take the steps to help an athlete, but they just might not know necessarily where the resources are.
This sounds like it's going to be an exploding field very soon in the near future. If it's not already, sort of like sports dietitians were, and obviously athletic trainers, and you keep going all the way back. But I guess to me, let's say I'm an athlete, I'm working directly with you, and I'm guessing this is going to be state law dependent. But can you, you're like, hey, Don, you need XYZ prescription. Are you able to write that prescription for me? Or do you have to work with my physician and suggest to my physician, hey, Don needs the following prescription for whatever the case might be? Can you talk a little bit more about how the prescription writing works?
Yeah, so it is state dependent. There's actually only about 20 states that allow pharmacists to prescribe. every pharmacist is allowed to do the test and treat program for COVID, so we can all potentially prescribe Paxlovid to a patient, for instance.
Okay.
But that is the only one that's really allowed at the federal level. Everything else is a partnership pretty much between the pharmacist and the prescriber, so that either it's a collaborative practice where the pharmacist can prescribe things independently once they kind of do, the history and gather the important information from the person in order to prescribe it to that person. And generally that's like oral contraceptives or birth control and nicotine products. Of course, pharmacists do specialize in really understanding over-the-counter products. So anything that that patient would be picking for themselves anyways, we can help a lot in that category, knowing what's best for them to self-treat with over-the-counter products. And but yeah, as you said, it does vary from state to state, and really, especially when it comes to athletes, I'm always talking to the dietitian to get a little bit more information about what's happening with this person that maybe they were more comfortable sharing with the dietitian or an athletic trainer than they would be sharing with me, and kind of putting a full picture together as I work with the athlete. So really a medical team approach.
Yeah, see, I like that. Now, would there be some prescriptions, some drugs that an athlete might take that maybe, some just your normal person who's into fitness wouldn't need? And I also get to thinking like, okay, we can start there. Maybe whether it's, pain management or, I'm thinking like anti-inflammatory medicine. But the other thing is too, is when it comes to mental health, which I think is everybody's addressing, it's out saying, I know there's a lot of great drugs out there depending on your type of condition. So if somebody were taking these types of drugs, I mean, what would differ from an athlete, I guess, than just your regular person out on the streets?
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the first part of your question, if there's anything, I mean, there are a lot of things that I do consider a little bit differently when it comes to athletes, but it is things that I consider for all patients. Like,
Okay.
for instance, stimulants are probably going to suppress a person's appetite. So, what does that mean for the athlete getting enough medications so that they get their calorie intake to meet their energy needs and not potentially, experience like REDS, for instance, which can show up as depression, symptoms of depression. So, when it comes to SSRIs, which is the most common class of medications used to treat depression nowadays, that's like Paxil or Prozac or things like that. And those medications can really change a person's bowel habits on how they digest and how their body responds to food as well. And so those are the kind of things that I'm kind of considering too. And also with some of those antidepressants, people kind of don't feel the same passion that they did or drive for even training or their sport sometimes. So working through those type of things, kind of anticipating them. And even pharmacogenomics is becoming more common to consider what is most appropriate for the patient before we even select the medication based on their genetics. So before we even start trying to look at what their genes do in the way of metabolizing medications or responding, and then selecting the most appropriate thing to start for them. So, so that's just a couple examples of, in the way of mental health. But with pain treatment, I mean, I think the NSAIDs, which are ibuprofen and Aleve, naproxen, that's probably one of the most common conversations I have outside of dietary supplements. And it's so important that not only the athletes, but a lot of times I'm talking to parents about how much is too much because
Yeah.
sometimes there's as there's that rush to return to play sometimes, and the risk of masking an injury, masking the pain in order to return to play quicker. And so I've seen my role a lot of the times being like the one who's going to say, okay, this may take care of the problem right now, but let's think about what that means to your kidneys. Let's think about what's going to happen with your hydration status, and how is this going to affect your heart long term. So even though those might not be the front of the mind for the athlete when I'm talking to them originally, I like to bring that into the conversation so that they know that that like the impact on the kidneys that ibuprofen can have, especially when combined with dehydration, that impact can be cumulative over time. So one injury will build on the next injury, will build on the next injury to the kidney, even though we're trying to treat something in the muscle. I
No,
mean,
I'm
sure,
really glad you pointed that out. I'm really
yeah,
glad because a lot of times we don't think about that, especially as athletes or as parents or as coaches. And one of the other things you've mentioned a couple times is dietary supplements, and you've
yeah,
referenced that. And as we talk to young people, one of
yeah,
the suggestions you always make is, prior to purchasing any dietary supplement, no matter what it is, be sure to visit with your family physician or even pharmacist about what it is that I'm taking and how that might interact with some of the prescription drugs that I'm already taking. Can you elaborate on why that's important, especially for the young people, parents, and coaches that are tuned in? Like, hey, so and so is using this protein product, or they're using this multivitamin or pre workout, or whatever the case might be, but they're not thinking about how that dietary supplement might interact with a prescription drug that they're already taking.
right. Yeah. Well, first of all, as your listeners probably know quite well, dietary supplements are not regulated as well as foods are. They're not as regulated as prescription products at all. And so, when it comes to athletes, there's many stories of people accidentally testing positive from things that were contaminating their products, even if it was intended to be just a cooking product, for instance. So, um, that lack of regulation has caused a lot of unknowns in the dietary supplement market. So we can never, we need to really use some of the best third-party independent testers in order to know that what is in the product actually matches what's on the label. Otherwise, I tell everyone I could put dirt in a capsule, sell it to you for anything I wanted, call it a dietary supplement, and get a whole
Yeah.
bunch of money from you. But
Yeah.
that's even though dietary supplement companies might have the best interest in mind and try to create the best product, sometimes even that contamination is outside of their control in the manufacturing process.
Very
So
true.
when I'm talking to athletes, especially right now with the social media having so much misinformation, I feel like that is such a louder voice than I have. What I'm often trying to do is dispel the information of, but look, they're just referring to a study in rabbits. Do you really want to be the next guinea pig that uses this ingredient that they're trying to pitch to you as something that's good for sport? Or, another point I use is just because we don't know it's prohibited right now doesn't mean that will change in 10 years. So if an elite athlete has a doping sample taken, we don't know it's prohibited now, but that substance becomes prohibited in the future because we have better testing, or it's found to actually be a prohibited substance, then they're still held accountable for that, and they're strictly liable for that, even that far down the line. um, with dietary supplements, when it comes to new ingredients, I think pharmacists are also really well trained to really pick apart the data. In our pharmacy school and in residencies, we really learn to evaluate studies and really try to break them down as to what bias is there, what kind of influence is there on that conclusion that they came to in this data. And so instead of just reading the conclusion about that ingredient or that product, we go back to the data and try to break that down to see, does that actually make sense? So just being a little bit more particular, but dietary supplements are such a huge risk for athletes.
Would you recommend to somebody, and I don't know how open a pharmacist would be to this, but I'm just thinking you walk into your local pharmacist and you're trying to select between two or three different products, whether it's for yourself or your loved one. Would it be okay? And do you think the pharmacist would be approachable if you're like, hey, I'm trying to decide between these dietary supplements and approach them? Because I don't think most people would even think to go ask the pharmacist about the dietary supplement, no matter what it is they're using it for. But I know I've asked before for like over the counter medicines. Hey, I've got a cold, I've got the sniffles. What would you recommend? And they're very open to that. But I've never thought about the two, maybe approaching them with a dietary supplement. What would be your recommendation?
Yeah. So this again would be an area that you really want to approach a sports pharmacist or somebody who's well trained in dietary supplements. Most schools of pharmacy don't teach about dietary supplements or herbals anymore. So that's one thing to consider initially. Most pharmacists will be willing to talk about dietary supplements because, of course, we consider those medications like anything else, just because of the way the body's going to respond. As you mentioned, just even drug interactions to consider. But a trained sports pharmacist will recognize that we need to make sure that that product meets certain criteria. And, oftentimes a pharmacist will use the OPSS scorecard in order to assess how risky that supplement is and help an athlete walk through the scoring process, evaluating that. When it comes to pharmacists, a lot of pharmacies do sell dietary supplements directly.
Yep.
And with sports pharmacists, it's best practice that the pharmacist fully disclose what their financial interest is in that and how they're affiliated with the companies, because otherwise, that financial bias could
Yeah.
creep into what they recommend. So there are good third-party testing companies out there, and so I kind of focus on whatever product the athlete is drawn to, which typically tends to be a team decision a lot of the time, what they're interested in most. And so then looking from there, if that company is going through third-party testing to make sure that that product is, clean and safe for an athlete. When it comes to dietary supplements and the general public or athletes who are not going to be tested, then, pharmacist does have a standard of using USP, which is the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is more of a pharmaceutical grade, a little bit step up from a dietary supplement, but not enough for athletes.
Okay.
And and then pharmacists, of course, they do have the ability to compound products as well. So they could potentially compound something, especially for the athlete. And then we have certificates that can actually tell us what that, the powder or whatever it is that we're receiving is actually meeting the quality standard that we would want,
Interesting.
the purity. So
I'm sitting here listening as a parent,
yeah.
and I'm like, okay, well, I'm just buying whatever random thing my young person wants off the shelf, but I had no idea there were sports pharmacists out there that could help me, maybe have a better selection of what it is that I'm purchasing for, whether it's myself or a loved one.
Yeah.
Where would somebody go to find a sports pharmacist versus just walking into any pharmacy and speaking with a pharmacist there?
Yeah, so we have the U.S. Sports Pharmacy Group, and that's a group of pharmacists and scientists, pharmaceutical scientists who are interested in drugs in sport, basically. And there are other pharmacies that do list that they have sports pharmacy services.
Okay.
But again, even as a parent, as I mentioned, we're not taught about this in pharmacy school, so not all pharmacists know about the anti-doping codes. And the number one priority should always be to keep the person safe when it comes to what we're giving out. But even giving, like, not advice, but even just looking at the energy drinks and sports drinks that my friends' kids were using, and I have a son of my own, but looking at what he's interested in drinking or whatever and what's popular. I always look at the ingredients and try to point it out to the kids. And there was one time I turned a product around and I was like, whoa, why does this have so much vitamin A? That's a fat soluble vitamin. And
Yeah, and it's almost like the average parent's not going to know to look for that.
Yeah, right. Like anything over 1,000%, you got to be like, do I need that much supplementation? This, even if it is just a nutrient or a vitamin, there are potential risks when it comes to that. It can be you can't overdo it when it comes to those things. So yeah, there are some red flags that we look for, and I think sports pharmacists and sports dietitians are well aware of those kind of things. And, as I mentioned before, those things just jump out at us where it doesn't for, your typical parents just going based on, what their young athlete wants to take. So
Yeah, and there's so much, like you said, so much information out there, especially when you get online. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm super glad you're sort of drawing these black and white lines as to, giving people steps and information of where they can go get really good information. So in our discussion, have I missed anything specific or important that a parent or young person might want to know when it specifically comes to sports pharmacy or pharmacists or medication or dietary supplements?
yeah, well, I don't think that we can underemphasize. I don't think that we can emphasize enough the importance of understanding the risk of contamination of dietary supplements. And, especially with SARMs nowadays, they're just
Mhm.
very high on my radar. I think that they've been downplayed. I think the use of them has been normalized in social media. That really scares me as a
Yes.
pharmacist. They haven't even gone through the clinical testing yet to demonstrate that they're safe. They've been in clinical tests for years and years and years, and they're not on the market yet. I feel like that's a red flag in itself, that they're not being passed through the process quickly, which might mean there are some safety indicators that we need to consider. So that's my biggest thing when it comes to dietary supplements. When it comes to the use of medications in athletes, one thing is that as mentioned, I often talk to athletes about what they need to watch out for, the side effects. And just as one scenario that came up just recently, I was working with an athlete who's a recreational athlete now, and he was having some shooting pain from kind of his shoulder down his arm, and so he was started on gabapentin, and the prescription was a high starting dose. And so I just opened up the conversation with, did your doctor discuss with you about the side effects to watch out for, because this is a relatively high starting dose? And he said that she had said that it would treat the pain, and he was just really anxious to get the pain under control. And so I had talked to the doctor about, first of all, starting a lower dose, and just discussing with that patient about starting that medication at night because it was probably going to cause drowsiness, but also explaining that there could potentially be changes in his vision, and he might have more blurred vision, and just talking through, how is that going to affect your sport, and is that going to affect training, or even work. And but the interesting thing about that was that he came back like a day and a half later, and we were just talking about pain control in general and managing the ibuprofen part of his pain control. And I could tell he was grumpier, and this person is normally so cordial, and I've never
Yeah.
seen that side of him. And I was like, well, that's unusual. Just must be having a bad day. And then his wife came up separately later, and she said to me, did you notice how grumpy he is? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, that did kind of stand out. And she is like, yeah, his personality is different. And to me, I was like, oh, mood changes with
Mhm.
gabapentin, that's something that we really need to watch out for. And she said to me, well, how do I know if it's the medication or the pain that he's feeling? Is the pain just making him grumpy? And so I said, well, did this grumpiness exist while he was in pain for the 2 weeks before starting gabapentin? And she was like, oh, no, you're right, this could be the medication. So I talked to the prescriber about actually changing to a different medication that wouldn't have that risk of that change in mood, because that's typically something changing neurologically in the brain, in the way that our mood is, and how we respond to life.
I've been there before. In fact, I've struggled with, after my brother passed away, with ADHD. I've always had it, but it was really trying to focus in school, and when you can't focus and your brain's going in 100 different directions at a million miles an hour, you're super frustrated. So I got prescribed an ADHD medication. It was an extended release, and I remember taking it, and I became super aggressive. My temper, and I don't have a temper. Like, you have to get me really, really mad. But I was getting really short with people, and they're like, "What's wrong?" And so I went back to my doctor, and I said, "Hey, I'm experiencing all this stuff." People are like, "Oh, your mood's changing," but I can completely relate. Like, I didn't feel good on it, and they had to put me on a different type of medication that wasn't extended release, for whatever reason. My body doesn't deal well with that. The other thing that you had mentioned that's really important is the SARMs, the selective androgen receptor modulators. That's becoming really popular. You're hearing more and more students talking about it. And for anybody listening that isn't familiar with it, we actually did a whole podcast on SARMs. I would highly encourage you to go to our podcast and search for that episode. It's really, really interesting. But especially as a parent, a coach, somebody that's around these kids, they are getting a lot of bad information on what these SARMs are, that essentially what you're going to hear is it's just like anabolic steroids, but they're super safe. And those claims are absolutely not true. So, what Ashley's been mentioning here is something we really need to be paying attention to, and as coaches and parents need to educate ourselves on.
Yeah. And I think it takes a direct question. You need to
Mm,
ask directly. Just be
yeah.
straightforward and say, hey, I know you're only in ninth grade, but have you heard about SARMs?
Yeah.
And, I think that opening the conversation and getting past our own fears about knowing that our
Yeah.
children might be doing that or might be even exposed to that, it takes the parents' lead to ask that and ask it directly. Be clear.
Yeah, no, you're right. And this has been wonderful advice. And again, so thankful for having you on. Now, before I let you go, any fan of the All Me podcast know that we close every podcast with what we call our curveball round. So
Okay.
this is going to have nothing to do with pharmacy school, medication or what have you. So I've prepared these questions, and here's what I always like to tell people. I'm going to read you this question. The first thing that comes to mind is how you'll want to respond. You tell me when you're ready, and we'll get going.
Okay. I'm all
All
set.
right, question one. Would you rather be invisible or be able to read minds?
Oh, invisible.
I think so. I think that'd be pretty cool too, right?
Reading
Just
minds
kind
might be a little bit overwhelming.
of. I'm trying to think of the movie that it was where they could hear people. It was. I think it was it Mel Gibson or something, and he could hear, I guess, women what they were thinking, and
Oh, yes.
I think it was. I don't remember the
Yep.
name of the movie, but that's
Yep.
what made me think of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. That's great.
So, question number two: if you could pick up a new skill in an instant, what would it be and why?
Oh gosh. A new skill. I think speed reading. I've always been a really slow reader, and I would love to read more just for leisure. And I feel like so much of my time is spent reading science type stuff that I don't take much time for leisure reading. So
I could use that skill too. It's like I'm reading and I get 2 pages and I was like, wait, what did I just read? Let me go back a couple of pages and I'll read that again.
Yep. How did that take me 20 minutes to read 2 pages?
Exactly. Did I really understand what they were trying to say there?
Yep.
All right. So the third and final question is, what fact about your life would most impress your 5-year-old self?
Oh gosh. Oh man. That's a great question. Probably I guess part of it would be that I ended up moving to Colorado, because as a kid, I love Michigan still. That's where I grew up, but I never saw myself leaving kind of the property that we grew up on, the family property. And so I think that would be one thing, that I actually live such a distance from my family. And that is probably one part that my 5-year-old would be completely shocked. My 5-year-old self would be completely shocked about. But I mean, I always joke that I'm solar powered, and where I lived in Michigan was not sunny enough, so I had to move to a sunnier state.
And your 5-year-old self, at least they would be prepping for the move ahead.
Yeah, yep, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Ashley, thank you again for taking time out of your schedule, sharing your knowledge. Again, I was so excited when we first talked, and I felt like I just berated you with questions, but I was sincerely interested in this topic because I think it's going to be that next leading field that I think you're going to start seeing professional sports teams first, and then colleges that are going to have sports pharmacists on staff to help them make these sorts of decisions as drugs evolve, as doping evolves, just to help combat, to make sure that our athletes aren't going to test positive or get sick or worse, have something detrimental happen to them.
Right. I mean, I used to joke, because I was one of the few pharmacists that did this, that I would be the secret weapon. Give advice to optimize medications, avoid doping, and kind of get all those medications right the best we can.
Yeah. Well, no, again, thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
You bet. We appreciate it. We appreciate your time and your knowledge.
Thanks.